Hello! Go ahead and get started with our Respiratory System Lab. Again, there is a model page on our Blackboard page for this particular lab if you want to be able to take some notes on that. Otherwise, there's also a worksheet that has some diagramming and labeling that I recommend using to follow along with this lab presentation. All right. So we start from page 53 and go through page 57 for this week's lab in the lab manual. And let's go ahead and get. So starting off, we've got objective 1 here, looking at external nares, which you'll find extending from the inside of the nose to kind of outside. So if we have a circle kind of pointing to this region here would be the external nares. Then we have our nasal cavity with our nasal concha. So this would be the cavity, and the nasal concha behind that lining with respiratory or nasal epithelia. All right, and behind that we have the conae. All right, so this is like kind of like the internal nares, external nares and internal nares. Then we have our bony hard palate, and this is kind of the roof of the mouth, the hard part, and then it extends into the soft part of the palate, which is the soft palate. All right, and that extends even further into our uvula. So we have our hard palate, which is kind of like the hard part of the roof of the mouth, extending into the soft palate, and then the uvula, or our gag reflex. And then we have these different regions that we can identify. So looking at your worksheet, if you were following along, we have 3 pharyngeal regions. Those are not going to have arrows coming from the boxes labeling them. So these are the regions that you should be identifying. All the other boxes that have arrows coming from will be specific structures. So we have our nasopharynx, our oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. So nasal being behind the nasal cavity, oro being behind the oral cavity or the mouth region, and the laryngopharynx being behind the larynx. All right. So 3 different regions of the pharynx. Within those different regions, we have some identifying structures. So for the nasopharynx, we have our auditory tube or our eustachian tube. We looked at that in our special senses lecture as well. We also have our pharyngeal tonsils. All right, so pharyngeal tonsils will be behind the nasal region. So this is part of our nasopharynx. So our pharyngeal tonsils. And then we have 2 more structures, and they're actually both tonsils when it comes to our oropharynx. We have our palatine tonsil. You can think about this as an extension from our palate. So palatine, palate. So hard palate, soft palate, uvula, palatine tonsil. Then we have our lingual tonsil, which is not shown on this particular model, but if you look at page 53 on your diagram, it is just behind the tongue. Lingual, language, tongue. Think about those different words when we're trying to identify this tonsil. Then we have objective 2, looking at our larynx. Then we have objective 2, looking at our larynx. We have our hyoid bone. This is going to be the bone that your tongue connects to. We have our epiglottis, which is going to help propel food into our esophagus and prevent it from going into our larynx. This is part of that swallowing or deglutination reflex, deglutition. Then we have our thyroid cartilage, which our thyroid would be kind of attached to on the outside here. So this will be the largest cartilage you need to identify. And the smaller one is the cricoid cartilage below that. So thyroid, cricoid. And then looking at this tubular view, we'll see our true vocal folds, preventing food and stuff from entering into the larynx even further. So when you cough, it helps propel it back out. But the actual purpose of it is actually just to help vibrations come from your trachea and your lungs to amplify into different tones and vocal acoustics. So true vocal folds or vocal cords, basically helping you speak and produce different sounds. And then we have our glottis, which your glottis is basically this region. It's not really a structure, but it's a region that is visible when the true vocal folds open up. All right, so you have your epiglottis that is epi, above the glottis. All right, it's preventing entry into the glottal region. So the glottis is just when the vocal folds open up. And then extending down from our trachea is our tracheal cartilage, or down from our larynx is our trachea, and it's covered with these C-ringed tracheal cartilages. Not part of our objective list by any means, but always good to have a nice foundation for what we're looking at here. Then we have objective 3, looking at our lungs. We have these pleura that we need to be able to look at. So just like our heart, when we're looking at the pericardium, we're looking at pleura here. So when we kind of take a snapshot of this region, we have our lung tissue, and right outside the lung tissue we have our visceral pleura. Whenever you see visceral, we're talking about organs. So right outside the organ, it's the layer right outside of that pleura. And then there's a space or a cavity. And then we have this parietal pleura that is attaching to the cavity wall here that the lungs are in, the thoracic wall, thoracic cavity. So parietal is on the outside, then we have the pleural cavity, and then the visceral pleura directly lining the lungs. And then we have the apex of the lungs at the top. All right, so the top point here is our apex. And then at the bottom of the lung, we have our base. All right, so don't get confused for the base from the diaphragm. Diaphragm is the actual skeletal muscle structure here at the bottom. If I point to the structure and I say, what is this? It's the diaphragm. Or if I point to this region, I say, what is this region or what is this area? I would say that's the base of the lung. Then we have the hilum of the lung, which is basically the region that the lungs congress. So basically, this region is going to be when the bronchi extend and branch off of the trachea and enter the lungs. Same thing with the arteries and veins. So this region where the lungs kind of meet is called this hilum. All right, it's the region where the bronchi enter the lungs. And then looking at our lobes, we have our left and right lobes. The left lobe has 2 lobes. The left lung has 2 lobes, I should say, and the right lung has 3. Don't worry about memorizing the different bronchopulmonary segments. Just understand that they are bronchopulmonary segments and that the right lung has 3 lobes and the left lung has 2 lobes. And then we have our skeletal muscle structure, the diaphragm. So this would be the model structure you would get on the quiz. I'd be pointing to this saying, what is the structure? You would tell me diaphragm. Or I'd say, what type of muscle is this structure made of? And you would tell me skeletal muscle. Or I could circle this region here and say, what is this region of this lung? And you tell me the base. Don't get confused with that in the diaphragm. They do look somewhat continuous. Just be able to parse the two and be aware that is a type of question you might get. Then we have our objective 4 here, looking at our trachea. So we have our larynx, which we already identified, our thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, and then our trachea extending from that. This trachea is covered with C-ring cartilages, and it has a tube on the inside for air passage. Then it branches into our first branching point, our primary bronchi, and then to our second branching point, secondary bronchi, and then our third branching point into tertiary bronchi. So first primary, second branch, secondary, third branch, tertiary. All right, so these little outside ones are all the tertiary bronchi. Then they branch even further into bronchioles. These bronchioles then branch into an alveolar duct, and the point of an alveolar duct is to flow into an alveoli. All right, so this alveolar duct will lead into a bunch of different alveolar pores, which are part of an alveolar sac. But based on your page 56 objective, you only need to be able to identify on this particular type of diagram bronchiole, alveolar duct, and alveolus. Going from that, we can see this tubular structure of the bronchiole heading into an alveolar duct and these alveoli. Let's visualize this at a microscopic level. So here's our lumen of our bronchiole entering into an alveolar duct, and then different alveoli. All right, so you can kind of see this would be like an alveoli sac here that this alveolar duct is supplying. So this entire type of tissue is simple squamous epithelia, aiding in quick diffusion of gases. So I could show you this picture and ask you, what type of tissue is this? You would say simple squamous epithelia. I'd say, where would you find this tissue? You would say the lungs. I could ask you, what are these? You would tell me alveoli. I'd ask you, what is this? You would tell me the bronchiole. All right, types of questions you might get on the quiz. Then we have a trachea that we could look at. Trachea has a few different things we should be able to identify, including this type of cell that the main part of the trachea lining is made of. That's pseudostratified columnar epithelia. All right, so it's pseudostratified. It looks like it's stratified, but it's actually just single columns. It's columnar, and it's epithelia, a lining. And it's ciliated. The cilia helps move mucus that the goblet cells produce to keep pathogens from entering our respiratory tract. So the cilia beat real nice all the way up until they meet with the pharynx, and then they can drop that mucus into our esophagus so that we can digest the pathogens and break them down instead of getting them into our lungs and getting pneumonia or bronchitis, all that horrible stuff that we don't want in our respiratory tract. And so one other thing that we need to be able to identify with the trachea is the hyaline cartilage that could be surrounding the trachea. So this is the snapshot we were just looking at here. Ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelia. This is the cilia. This would be those seromucous glands right here. And then we would be extending into the cartilage that would be surrounding the trachea in protection, keeping it from collapsing. All right. So you can kind of see right here what we're looking at here. This trachea. This would be the lumen. All right. And that actually does it for today's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, we'll chat soon.